you much on that end, but hopefully she can help or ping me and I can do what I can. Paul, take it away and I will move your slides for you when you want me to.
Thank you very much, Lindsay. Can everybody hear me? Lindsay, can you hear me all right?
Sound great.
All right. I am Paul O'Neill, and I am with the National Center for Special Education in Charter Schools. And as Lindsay pointed out, a lot of things coming out these days. Even this is the third time this week that we're doing a set of presentations. So I want to focus on privacy issues as they relate to the COVID-19 virus. I don't know if you folks heard, but there's a virus going on all around the world and people are trying to respond to it. So I'm going to talk about privacy issues from that as they relate to kids with disabilities. So the National Center for Special Education Charter Schools, just a couple of words on us. We are an independent nonprofit organization that is an inch wide and a mile deep. We try to involve ourselves in lots of things that are going on within the scope of special ed and charter schools, and these days beyond charter schools as they cross over into other public options. We have 4 main areas of specialization. We try and document and communicate facts. We try to weigh in on policy issues at the state and national level. We work on developing coalitions to get people together to talk about these issues and brainstorm and share best practices. And we try to do work on the ground, building capacity in particular locations among cohorts of schools and authorizers and other groups. Next.
And I would just weigh in there just that we as a National Center do work on informing policy, but the Educating All Learners Alliance is not taking any policy position. So I just want to clarify there that Paul in his center hat, we do inform policy, but as ELA, we are not weighing in on any policy issues.
Thank you, Lindsay. The other thing I want to point out is that I am an education lawyer, but this is not legal advice. This presentation is not legal advice. I'm not wearing that hat. So let's keep that in the back of our minds. All right, so this is a quick presentation, but these are the areas going to cover, a little bit of background on these issues and the disruptions that have come so far, some flexibilities that have been granted in trying to deal with the privacy issues, but continuing challenges and maybe a little bit of thinking about what happens next. So when we look at the notion of privacy in schools, we look to a couple of different areas of the law. There are federal laws, and then we build state laws on top of them. The ones listed here are all federal laws. Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, FERPA, is the main one that you would be interacting with in a school setting. It deals with educational records and focuses particularly on schools. The Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, which is HIPAA, is more of a medical-oriented thing, which is not as prevalent in the school setting. Protects health information and usually applies to healthcare organizations and insurers, other sorts of healthcare providers, but to the extent that the work in schools crosses over into providing therapies, it is relevant for us. And then we always have the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, the IDEA, ensuring that IEPs, student IEPs, have privacy protections as well, and we want to make sure that that's part of the mix. All right, so as the virus created all sorts of disruptions, as you all know, schools were forced on the fly without a whole heck of a lot of preparation to deal with a transference from what they were used to doing, from the program that they were offering, to something they could do remotely. And in many cases, that ended up being something that is provided online or primarily online. Folks used a variety of techniques, but there's a lot of that going on. Most of these schools are not schools that had a virtual component to what they were doing or any sort of distance learning component. So they were scrambling and they had to figure out what they were going to do. A lot of them shifted to online. A lot of them did that in a way that didn't come with a lot of forethought around privacy issues. Now, leave it on that slide for a second, Lindsay. Early on, when we first got it started, the kinds of questions that I was getting as an attorney for schools were not so much about teletherapy, but they were about communicating privacy issues to the school community about people who were becoming identified as having been infected by the virus. And so a lot of FERPA questions came first. So FERPA is the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, which is, the main privacy law that we're dealing with in schools. And this wasn't restricted to a special education consideration, but it was a very important one at first. If you find out that a teacher or a student or a parent of a student has been identified as having the virus, what do you communicate? And that was an issue that took over the first 2 weeks, let's say. I think largely at this point, people have been out of schools for long enough that they wouldn't have been next to somebody else who you need to communicate with. But some states are newer to doing this virtual education than others have sort of reopened after an initial closure. And so, so the answer to that is that there are provisions within FERPA that say in an emergency, you can communicate information that would be otherwise private about students that need to get communicated to health officials and public safety officials and that sort of thing. But you certainly want to be careful about any of that. If anybody has any questions about that, put it in the chat function and I can respond to things that relate to those sorts of privacy questions because we're not going to revisit them here. All right, go ahead. But teletherapy is really the thing that we want to talk about here. When I say teletherapy, I'm talking about special education and related services, things that would fall into the category of services that get provided to students with IEPs because they have disabilities, and that could be a variety of different kinds of occupational and speech services and physical therapy. Providing related services remotely is tricky. And when it was done, it triggered a bunch of privacy concerns, many of them related to HIPAA. HIPAA allows for online health-related services, but only, at least according to their rules, through platforms that have proven to be secure and approved by HIPAA. They also have some rules about only using secured personal devices and computers that are sort of from the organization that you're talking about. But these rules about HIPAA confidentiality quickly came up. So schools have been desperate to switch to remote learning, and they adopted platforms that are like Zoom and some other standard non-technical sorts of platforms. And those platforms were not on the list of things that were HIPAA approved. You go through a process for that, and they hadn't done that. They weren't being used for that previously. And technically that violated the rules. So charter authorizers and state authorities and other regulatory entities were concerned. They wanted to make sure that the schools weren't breaking the rules. They didn't know what to say about any of this. Everybody's scrambling, and they didn't know what to do. So without a lot of delay, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, through its Office of Civil Rights, and by the way, there's an Office of Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Education, but this is a different group, they issued a waiver. So they jumped in and on the fly responded to these concerns that people felt like they didn't A, know what to do, and B, didn't know what they, as in an oversight capacity, needed to hold people accountable for doing. So go to the next one. Now this is language from the ruling that came out in the middle of March from the Health and Human Services folks. So I'm just going to read it. Healthcare providers subject to HIPAA rules may seek to communicate with patients and provide telehealth services through remote communications technologies. Some of these technologies and the manner in which they are used by HIPAA-covered healthcare providers may not fully comply with the requirements of HIPAA rules. OCR, meaning the OCR of HHS, not OCR of the U.S. Department of Education, will exercise its enforcement discretion and will not impose penalties for non-compliance with the regulatory requirements under the HIPAA rules. So they're basically saying you need to use good faith in trying to do this, do the best you can. Okay. They did, though, in that same notice, indicate which platforms they were good with and a handful of ones that they are not good with. So the ones that they identified as being fine for telehealth, although not approved for HIPAA requirements, are Apple FaceTime, Facebook Messenger, Google Hangouts, and Zoom. they mentioned that because they're public facing primarily or exclusively, Facebook Live, Twitch, and TikTok, 2 of the 3 of which I have never heard of, are not okay. Now, one more, Lizzie, next slide. They also listed a handful of ones that are actually HIPAA approved, and that through these platforms, you can enter into a sort of private business associate agreement, they call it, to try and fine tune and allow for a maximum of security. And you see the ones listed here. I haven't heard of most of these, but you should know that you can do that. Now, let's go to the next. So I say problems part 2 because people got comfortable with this. And people started, I was talking to folks all across the country, and people were getting used to using teletherapy to do the work that they needed to do. They weren't worried about the oversight problems that might come without that flexibility. And many of them are using Zoom. Zoom is a pretty common program. And then now somebody included in this slide here, someone from our organization, some funny pictures that were from I guess a screen capture. But those aren't the kind of problems that we were having with what they were starting to call Zoom bombing. We were having problems with people doing things that were inappropriate in a sexual nature, in a racial bias kind of nature. I mean, unpleasant things were happening because people started to join Zoom calls that they were not supposed to be a part of. And that's a breach of confidentiality, and that's not okay. And so what we've seen in this sort of part 2 of the problems is that some districts are starting to say, well, hold on, then if they can't be secure, then you can't use them. And the most notable one of those was New York City. Last weekend, New York City announced that you can't use Zoom anymore. It is now unacceptable for district schools. So, biggest district in the country cannot use Zoom, and the providers, the therapy providers, are forbidden to use that as a platform. There's some language that they included in it that said, well, we'll be tolerant and we'll be patient and it'll take you a little time and you can move it over, but you do have to switch. Now in New York, charter schools are not part of a district, and in dealing with the charter schools there, I was at first not so clear as to whether in providing these teletherapy services, the charter schools could or could not use Zoom. And so that's gone back and forth like so many things over the last few weeks. We started the week with no answer and we ended the week with a little bit more of an answer. I've seen folks communicate to me in writing information that they got from the district saying, you're not going to get in trouble as a charter school if you use teletherapy over Zoom. We're not going to come after you on that. That's a judgment call they're making. I'm glad they're making it, but they are holding the line for district schools, and I think that this is the kind of thing you may see at other places. Go ahead. Zoom, in response to pushback, and I'm sure what is an incredible opportunity for them to expand the scope of the services that they provide, has been adding password protections. And most of you, if you're like me, have been on a lot of these calls over the last week or so, and you're seeing that passwords are starting to be required, and Zoom's interface has changed so that you only see, in some cases, the person who's presenting, and you don't see anybody else, and there are all kinds of limitations. And in fact, there's a network in New York that was telling me that they already had an arrangement with Zoom that was much more private than the public Zoom account, which is, I guess, what the New York City Department of Education was using. And so I think there's a lot of questions about what's available and how do you get it and what's okay. And I think that that's going to continue. I think platforms all over the place are trying to do what they can to raise to the challenge and the opportunity of having their services be used this way. But I have to say that I think that it's likely that we have passed a threshold where we're probably not going to go back to exactly the way things were done before, and we're creating the capacity now to handle privacy issues, student security issues via these virtual platforms. And I think the likelihood is that it's going to be part of the new normal. When we talk about loosening the rules, when HHS says, don't worry about it, you can use these non-secured platforms, that's one of those things that's helpful in the short term, like special powers that you give to the president, after 9/11. It allows people to take action in the short term, but it also maybe creates some risks for other considerations, such as security. I mean, are we concerned about student safety of the sorts of information that we're trying to keep private? HIPAA has that rule for a reason, right? We're slackening that. And I think we need to pay attention to the fact that we want to make sure that we haven't injured schools and kids with disabilities because we have made it easier for us to scramble here. And in the longer term, the medium and the longer term, I think those are things that we're going to have to make sure that we've gotten right. So keep going. All right. Anybody have a question?
Please go ahead and type any questions you have into the chat box. I can tell there's one already from Eric Tucker asking, can you use Zoom Health or other Zoom enterprise solutions in New York City as a charter? I know you kind of partially answered that they said they're not going to enforce it, but do you know anything about the other Zoom sister platforms?
Your audio went out as you were, or at least for me, as you were saying that. Could you just say that again?
Yep, Eric Tucker, who has a charter school in Brooklyn, for those who don't know, is asking if, as a New York City charter, if they can use Zoom Health or other Zoom enterprise solutions in New York City.
I would say, Eric, it's broader than that. The information that I have, and I'm trying to get them to write it down on paper, is that they are not going to hold schools accountable, charter schools accountable to not using Zoom or whatever services they were already using. They're not trying to do this in order to impose that on them, that they are just going to let you do what you need to do. But I will say that the providers who are offering these services, the consultants, the providers who are going to give the speech therapy or whatever sort of therapy it is, they are being held accountable by the district. So if you're looking for the district to be providing those services, then you may have a smaller pool of people from the outside of your organization who can provide them.
And someone else is asking how HIPAA regulations for school psychologists and social workers apply. Specifically, are parents allowed in a session that usually would be private and confidential?
I'm not aware of a limitation on that. I think that everybody, I mean, I also, first of all, I don't claim to be the world's biggest expert on HIPAA, but I haven't heard that articulated.
Great. And another one is, can Zoom be used to facilitate an IEP meeting? I know we've talked a lot about that.
Yeah, I think that there is an awful lot of creativity being put to work in trying to figure out how we can move forward with special education considerations in this time. The U.S. Department of Education has issued 3 different sets of guidance over the last couple of weeks. And one of them drills down specifically on the notion that you should not be thinking that it's illegal to move forward with special education meetings and services and whatnot in an online platform. And I would say that this falls into that category. I have not seen any particular limitation on Zoom for use in that context. The only one that I have heard is in the HIPAA context. So I would say, yes, you should do what works.
Great. I think that's all the questions we have. Do other people? Oh, here's another one. When a charter has violated a student's FERPA and HIPAA via disclosing IEP, what is the recourse?
Well, the HIPAA guidance specifically says that the or else here is that they would issue, you would be punished. You would have some kind of penalty imposed on you if you do it wrong. And so, the reality is that they have slackened those rules in the ways that I've described. But it also said that you're not allowed to use TikTok. If you use TikTok, I think that there's the chance that they're going to come after you and impose some kind of sanction on you. I'm not sure exactly what that would look like in that particular case. Same thing with FERPA. But I really have to say that I think that it is likely that as everybody in good faith tries to scramble and do all of this work in a way that nobody anticipated doing, there's going to be a tremendous amount of flexibility and grace on the back end as people look back and say, did we do exactly what we should have been doing? And what I keep advising people is the most important thing is to keep track of what you're doing. The folks who are going to get in trouble, I think, are the folks who can't tell you what they did. The folks who are saying, well, you know, at first I think we were doing this, and then I think we kind of did that, and for each individual student, we're not sure. You've got to keep incredibly good records. You have to keep good records about your practices in general and individualized to kids. And then I think what you will find is that people are forgiving if you didn't get it perfect.
Great. Someone has asked to share that HIPAA approved list. We will send out the slides and they'll be available on the website shortly so that we can have that list back up. And then do you need a specific consent form for virtual services like academic intervention groups?
Do you need a specific consent
form
for virtual services? Mm-hmm. I don't know of the need for a specific consent. I mean, again, it sort of falls into this category of being really explicit. I think that initially it seemed as though the guidance could be interpreted that that switching folks over to a virtual platform for IEP meetings or for other services would be a change in placement, would be a change that would require an IEP team to meet and to get the parent specific consent to say, okay, this is how we're going to do it. But increasingly, I think the authorities that keep being quoted, including some of the federal ones, seem to be saying, well, if all of the students in the school are being shifted to a different platform for learning, then that doesn't have to be something that requires an IEP meeting to justify or to clarify or to make legitimate. And so then I would say it's not 100% clear to me that you need to have a particular form that says we can do this exactly this way. I would still say, and I'm not your lawyer, I would still say it's a good idea. It's a good idea to have everything be really explicit, to have parents very clearly acknowledge that they understand that this is a new way of learning and they're okay with it. If they won't do that, if you're talking to parents and they're like, yeah, we don't think our kid can learn this way. Or if in a very plausible circumstance, the parent's just not responsive. Maybe there's all kinds of crazy stuff going on and they just aren't being responsive to you. Then your school needs to make a determination about whether it can provide those services now, or if it needs to defer those services as the guidance makes clear that you can do where the services really can't be provided during this crazy period. You might need to defer those services as compensatory services and offer those services when we all get back to something more normal.
Great, thank you. And are there any privacy protections in an IEP that you see being jeopardized by COVID? And I think, Rachel, you can pipe in if you want to expand on this, but I assume you mean by the situation around COVID, not by someone having COVID themselves?
Yes, correct.
Rachel, say a little bit more about that.
Well, you had just mentioned earlier on that there are some privacy protections in IEPs. And I'm just curious if you can expand on those and if there have been any talk about, this context, this new context, jeopardizing any of those privacies and what the guidance has been on those.
Well, I mean, when we talk about teletherapy as a practice and the security risks that are involved in that, we are talking about some of the privacies that are inherent in the IEP. I mentioned before that FERPA protects that the IDEA protects, and ultimately FERPA would too, the privacy of the IEP itself. That the information that is shared, the records, you need to make sure that you have a way of accessing student records remotely. If remote is how you're going to do this, you need to have a way of accessing those that keep the safety of the IEP. That you need to have them be secure. I mean, if you're in your office with a stack of IEPs, those need to be protected in a file cabinet with a locked drawer. We have to continue to treat these records themselves as confidential, and we're sticking our necks out a little bit to say we can use platforms that might not be approved as being secure, but all the different elements are part of that privacy.
Great. And I think we have time for one more question. Eric's written a couple of things in, so I'm going to let him ask you himself. Eric,
all right.
There you go.
Hi, thank you for making time for this webinar. I'm kind of picking up on your guidance about revising IEPs during this period.
Yep.
In New York State, there's a prohibition on charter schools kind of providing virtual learning experiences rather than brick and mortar learning experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And my understanding is that a lot of the services that we're providing in the interim are kind of stopgap and exist under the 180-day waivers. So they're not school days. They don't count as school days. They're just kind of additional nice things that are happening in this period. And we're pushing to have them be really high quality and effective, but we also kind of don't understand their relationship to IEP service compliance, and would love your thinking on that.
Yeah. Well, Eric, I mean, I think this is evolving as we go. I think the biggest, heaviest questions were dealt with first, and this is a little more remote than some of the other ones were. I certainly agree with you that folks are offering services remotely now through online means and other means, not because they think this is the greatest way to do it, but because they think it's possible, And I think that there are going to be lines that need to be drawn between services that are offered because let's do what we can, rather than we now think that this is legally sufficient, that this checks all the boxes that we need to check both under federal law and in your case under New York law. And I just don't think we're there far enough yet. I think that question is on a list of questions that I haven't seen the answers to yet. But I also think that you, especially your school, which is utilizing, a lot of innovative practices, I think you should, and you, I'm sure will, have a voice in trying to define the answer to that. And I would say the same thing to everybody on this call. Don't assume that you can just sit back and wait and have somebody tell you what the rule's going to be. I think this is a unique moment when folks can have some input into what the rules are.
Great.
So much. Wait, I had one other slide that had a couple of there. I just want to mention this quickly. So the top one is a FERPA document that came out really at the very sort of earlier part of this. And I think that if you want to drill down on some of these privacy questions, that's a good document to look at. The second one is the notice that came out from HHS saying we're going to soften up these rules. And anybody who wants the list I mentioned before of which of these platforms that are okay, which of these platforms aren't okay, and the language I actually quoted in the other slide, they're all in that link.
Yep, and I'm just popping them right back up here in case someone was wanting them right now. So those resources are posted on the ELA resource page, and including a document that the National Center put out that kind of goes over all of that federal guidance that's been put out thus far. So if anybody has follow-up questions on that, please look for it there. A link to the webinar and also to these slides will be posted at educatingalllearners.org within the next day or two, so look out for that there. We also have many more events, webinars, office hours, and other opportunities to engage coming up, so keep an eye out for more to come. Thank you so much, Paul.
Thank you all.
Thank you.